Cold rain fell on the village of Ashendale like judgment from a sky that had already made up its mind. In the square, an iron cage hung from a wooden post, swinging with every gust, and inside it sat a girl no older than 19, her arms wrapped around her knees, her lips cracked from 4 days without water. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, though the villagers had stopped using her name 3 nights ago. Now they called her the Cursed Girl, the one who brought the blight to the wheat fields, the one whose mother had died screaming about a fire that never happened. Nobody had asked Eleanor a single question before they dragged her from the miller's barn where she slept. Nobody had asked her anything at all. She had stopped crying on the 2nd day. Tears took water she did not have to spare. The crowd had gathered again that morning, the way they gathered every morning to watch her fade a little more, when the ground began to tremble under the weight of something the village had never seen up close. 4 black horses came over the rise, pulling a carriage trimmed in silver, and behind the carriage rode 6 men in the livery of a house whose name alone could empty a courtroom. The crowd parted before they were told to. The carriage stopped at the foot of the cage, and a man stepped down, whose coat was worth more than every roof in Ashendale combined. He did not look at the magistrate. He did not look at the priest, who had signed the order that put her there. He looked only at the girl behind the bars, and something in his face changed in a way none of the villagers understood, and would spend years pretending they had. "Open it," he said, and his voice did not rise, because men like him had never needed to raise their voices to be obeyed. No one moved fast enough for him. He crossed the mud himself, took the key from the trembling magistrate's belt, and opened the cage with his own hands. That man was Gideon Ashford, Duke of Ravenswood, and the girl he lifted out of that cage, wrapped in his own coat, carried past a village too stunned to speak. She had no way of knowing yet that his arrival was not chance, that her father's name was written in a promise this duke had carried for 11 years, or that the same hands that had built the cage around her had also built the lie that would nearly cost her everything a second time. If you want to see how a starving girl in an iron cage becomes a woman no drawing room in England can afford to underestimate, stay with me. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Now, let us begin. The carriage rocked over the rutted road out of Ashendale, and Eleanor sat wrapped in wool that smelled of cedar and horse leather, watching the man across from her as though he might vanish if she blinked. He had not spoken since they left the village. He simply watched the fields go by, his jaw set, his hands folded over a walking stick topped in silver. Eleanor had seen grief before. She had worn it herself the day her mother died, in a fever no physician in Ashendale had bothered to treat properly, because treating the poor cost coins the poor did not have. But this man's grief was older than hers, folded and refolded so many times it had become armor. She did not trust armor. Armor meant a man had something to protect, and men who protected things did not usually protect strangers pulled out of cages. "You are not going to ask me why," the Duke said finally, without turning his head. "I assumed you would tell me if you wanted me to know." That earned her the first look he had given her since the cage. Something almost like surprise crossed his face, quickly buried again. Most people in your position would be asking a great many questions. Most people in my position have learned that questions rarely get honest answers. Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her hands, hidden in the folds of the borrowed coat, were shaking. "I would rather wait and watch." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its iron. "Your father's name was Edmund Whitmore. He was the Earl of Callaway, and he was my closest friend for 20 years. Eleanor's breath caught. She had never known her father. Her mother spoke of him only in fragments, in half-finished sentences swallowed before they became whole, in a locket she was never permitted to open. "My mother told me he died before I was born." "Your mother told you that because it was safer for you to believe it." The Duke's eyes met hers now, steady and sorrowful. "Edmund did not die of illness or accident. He was murdered 11 years ago, and on the night he died, He made me swear to find his daughter and protect her, whatever it cost me. I have spent 11 years searching for a child who was hidden so well, I began to believe she did not survive. The carriage wheel struck a stone, and Eleanor gripped the seat to steady herself, though it was not the road that had unsettled her. You are telling me my father was a nobleman. I am telling you that you are the rightful heir to an estate that has been managed in your absence by a man who has every reason to want you to remain lost. He looked out the window again, and for a moment, the grief returned, thicker than before. I am also telling you that I failed him for 11 years, and I do not intend to fail him for an 11th year longer. Eleanor said nothing. She turned the words over the way she once turned over stones in the riverbed, looking for the sharp edge that would cut her if she was not careful. A father she never knew, a murder no one had told her about. A man who wept, she suspected, more than his posture allowed him to admit. She thought of the cage, of the villagers who had watched her wither without a flicker of mercy, and she understood, with a clarity that startled her, that the danger she had escaped that morning might only be the smallest of the dangers waiting ahead. The countryside rolled past the window, green and impossibly soft after the mud of Ashendale, and somewhere beyond the hills a manor house waited, with a name she did not yet know how to carry. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and made herself a private promise, the kind she intended to keep long after the Duke's carriage came to a stop. She would learn every rule of this new world before she trusted a single person in it, including, perhaps especially, the man seated across from her with sorrow in his eyes, and a silver-topped cane he gripped, like a man holding on to the last solid thing in his life. The carriage stopped once, near midday, at a coaching inn, where the Duke's men changed horses and brought food to the door, rather than allow her to step inside, among strangers who might recognize the smell of the village, still clinging to her borrowed coat. Eleanor accepted the bread and cheese, with hands that would not quite stop trembling, hunger and disbelief warring inside her in equal measure. She had learned, in 4 days without food, to eat slowly, no matter how badly her body begged her to devour everything at once, and she noticed the Duke watching her do it, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes softened further each time she resisted the urge to rush. You needn't ration yourself any longer, he said quietly, when the innkeeper's boy had gone. There will be enough food, from now on, more than enough. Old habits are not so easily set aside. Eleanor broke the bread into smaller pieces anyway, out of instinct rather than defiance. I have learned that believing a thing will last is often how a person ends up with nothing at all. The Duke did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a weight she had not expected. Your father used to say something similar, in his own way. He never trusted comfort either. Not fully. Not after the war years took nearly everything his own family owned. He rebuilt Calloway from very little, Eleanor. I imagine that is part of why he loved your mother as he did. She understood what it meant to build something out of almost nothing. You knew my mother. Briefly, only once, before Edmund sent her away to protect you both. A shadow crossed his face. I did not understand, at the time, how serious the danger truly was. I have spent a great many years regretting that I did not press him harder for the truth, while there was still time to act on it together. The carriage resumed its journey as the afternoon light began to soften into gold, and Eleanor found herself, despite every instinct urging caution, studying the man across from her with something gentler than suspicion. Grief, she was beginning to understand, was not proof of goodness. But it was, perhaps, a kind of honesty a person could not easily fake for a stranger pulled out of a cage that same morning. She thought of the locket her mother had kept hidden beneath a floorboard in their small room above the miller's barn, the one Eleanor had never been permitted to open, and wondered, for the first time, whether it held a portrait of the father she was only now beginning to learn had existed at all. The manor rose out of the mist, like something out of the stories Eleanor's mother used to whisper to her before sleep, back when there had still been a roof over their heads and food enough to make bedtime stories feel like luxury rather than distraction from hunger. Ravenswood Hall did not simply stand upon its hill. It commanded the hill, 3 stories of grey stone and tall windows, ivy climbing one wing, as though even the plants understood their place in the hierarchy of the house. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, on legs still unsteady from days without proper food, and the household staff arranged themselves along the entrance in 2 silent rows, watching her with expressions carefully schooled into neutrality that did not quite hide their curiosity. An older woman in a grey dress and a ring of keys at her waist stepped forward first. Her face was lined but not unkind, and when she looked at Eleanor, something behind her eyes softened. "This is Mrs. Bell, my housekeeper," the Duke said. "She has run this house since before I inherited it, and she will see that you have everything you require." Mrs. Bell curtsied, but it was the warmth in her voice that caught Eleanor off guard. "You'll forgive the staring, miss. We were not told to expect a guest, only that His Grace would be returning with someone important to him." Important. The word settled strangely in Eleanor's chest, foreign and unfamiliar, like a garment cut for someone else's shoulders. Inside, the hall opened into a space so vast that Eleanor's footsteps seemed to vanish into the ceiling rather than echo off it. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashford staring down with the same composed severity, and a staircase wound upward in a curve so graceful it looked drawn rather than built. "You will have the blue room," the Duke said, already moving toward his study, as though the tour, brief as it was, had exhausted whatever patience he had for pleasantries. "Mrs. Bell will arrange for a physician, a seamstress, and anything else you require. I have matters to attend to." He paused at the study door, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded once, as though confirming something to himself, and disappeared behind the heavy door. Mrs. Bell led her upstairs, chattering gently about meal times and the location of the linen closets, but Eleanor barely heard her. She was too busy noticing the things that did not fit, the tension in the younger maid's shoulders when they thought no one was watching, the way one footman's eyes lingered on her a beat too long before he looked away, the faint, unmistakable sense that this house, for all its grandeur, was holding its breath. That evening, after a bath scented with lavender and a meal richer than anything she had eaten in a year, Eleanor sat in the blue room's window seat and watched the sun set over grounds that stretched farther than she could see. A knock came at the door, soft and hesitant. It was a young maid, no older than Eleanor herself, carrying a folded nightgown and a look of barely contained nerves. "I'm Sarah, miss. I'll be seeing you while you're here." She set the nightgown on the bed and lingered a moment longer than necessary. "It's a kindness, what His Grace did today. There's some in this house who'll say otherwise, but I wanted you to hear it from someone who means it." "Who would say otherwise?" Sarah's face closed like a door pulled shut. "Best not to ask that on your first night, miss. Best just to sleep well and let tomorrow come when it comes." She left before Eleanor could press further, and Eleanor sat alone in a room larger than any home she had ever known, turning Sarah's warning over in her mind. Somewhere in this house of grey stone and silent portraits, there were people who did not welcome her arrival. She thought again of Mrs. Bell's word was important and wondered, not for the first time that day, exactly what kind of importance she had been given, and to whom it truly belonged. Outside, the last light faded from the hills, and Eleanor Whitmore closed her eyes in a bed softer than any she had known, promising herself that comfort would not make her careless. She woke before dawn out of habit, the way she had woken every morning of her life, to milk goats or gather kindling before the sun fully cleared the hills, and lay for a long moment, disoriented by the absence of chores waiting to be done. When she finally rose and dressed herself, unwilling yet to ring for a maid over such a small task, she found her way down a servant's stair to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of baking bread and the comfortable clatter of a household already at work. The cook, a broad, red-faced woman named Mrs. Pruitt, startled badly at finding a lady of the house standing uninvited in her domain, but Eleanor's easy request to simply sit and watch, rather than be waited upon, seemed to disarm the woman's alarm more thoroughly than any apology could have. Within a quarter hour, Eleanor found herself peeling potatoes at the kitchen table, while 3 scullery maids traded gossip they clearly had not intended for her ears. It was there, quietly, and without meaning to eavesdrop, that Eleanor first heard Lord Reginald Cross's name spoken among the staff. "He was here again last month, while His Grace was in London," one of the younger maids murmured, not troubling to lower her voice as much as she might have, if she had noticed Eleanor's presence at the far end of the table. "Went through the Northern account books himself." "He did, though Mr. Ferris usually handles those." "Didn't sit right with me." "Best not to speak of it," an older maid warned. "Not our business, what the family does with their coal money." Eleanor kept peeling potatoes and said nothing, filing the exchange away with the same careful attention she had given every detail since the cage door opened. She was learning, already, that a house as large and silent as Ravenswood spoke most honestly through its servants, in the small, unguarded moments no one thought to perform for an audience. By the time Mrs. Bell found her in the kitchen an hour later, scandalized to discover her charge among the pots and potato peelings, Eleanor had already decided that she would return, quietly and often, whenever the Manor's carefully maintained silences threatened to tell her nothing at all. Eleanor met Lord Reginald Cross on her 4th morning at Ravenswood, and she disliked him before he had finished crossing the breakfast room. He was a tall man, elegantly dressed in a manner that tried too hard to appear effortless, with pale eyes that moved over Eleanor the way a merchant's eyes moved over goods he intended to underpay for. He bowed to her with exaggerated grace, the kind of bow that mocked its own formality. "So this is the Duke's little discovery," he said, taking a seat without invitation. "Ravenswood has been in something of an uproar since your arrival, Miss Whitmore. The servants can speak of little else." "I imagine an unexpected guest would cause talk in any house," Eleanor said carefully. "Unexpected. Yes, that is one word for it." Reginald's smile did not reach his eyes. "I am the Duke's cousin, you understand. 3rd in line, once, before circumstance rearranged the family tree rather dramatically in my favor. I have been rather comfortable in my expectations these past years. It is disorienting to have them disturbed." Eleanor said nothing, though she filed the words away carefully. Expectations disturbed. A man accustomed to inheriting something now watching a stranger arrive who might change the arithmetic of his future. "You needn't look so wary," Reginald continued, buttering a piece of toast with unhurried precision. "I am merely making conversation. Though I confess, I am curious how a girl from a village cage came to be seated at the Duke of Ravenswood's breakfast table within a week. Perhaps you should ask His Grace." "Oh, I intend to." Something flickered behind Reginald's pale eyes, gone before Eleanor could name it. "Gideon has always had a weakness for lost causes. His late wife was the same. God rest her. It is a noble quality, in theory. In practice, it tends to leave the rest of us cleaning up the consequences." He rose, bowed again, with the same mocking flourish, and left her alone in the breakfast room, with her tea gone cold, and her appetite gone with it. Later that day, Eleanor found Mrs. Bell in the linen room, and asked, as casually as she could manage, about Lord Reginald. Mrs. Bell's hands stilled over the folded sheets. "He manages some of the estate's northern holdings, miss. Coal interests mostly. He visits more often than His Grace would prefer, if I'm honest, though a housekeeper oughtn't say such things. Why would His Grace prefer he visit less?" Mrs. Bell glanced toward the door before answering, her voice dropping. "There was talk, some years back, about how the northern accounts were kept. Nothing was ever proven. His Grace let the matter rest, for the sake of family peace." She resumed folding, her movements brisk now, closing the subject as firmly as Sarah had closed it on Eleanor's first night. "It is not my place to say more, miss, and I'd ask you not to repeat what little I have." Eleanor promised she would not, though she kept every word. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered the upstairs corridor and paused before a portrait she had not noticed on her first tour, tucked in a shadowed alcove near the east stairs. It showed a man with kind eyes and a warm, easy smile, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who could only have been a very young Duke Gideon. Beneath the frame, a small brass plate read, "Edmund Whitmore, Earl of Callaway, beloved friend of this house." Eleanor stood before the portrait for a long time, studying a face she had never seen before and would have known nowhere else, searching for pieces of herself in the shape of his jaw, the set of his brow. Somewhere in this house, in ledgers and letters she had not yet been permitted to see, lay the truth of how her father had died and who had profited most from his death. She thought of Reginald Cross's pale, assessing eyes, and the word disturbed circled back through her mind, like a bell that would not stop ringing. The following week, Reginald returned to Ravenswood for supper, and Eleanor watched him with new eyes, studying the way he addressed the household staff, with a carelessness that bordered on contempt. The way his gaze moved constantly to Gideon whenever the Duke spoke, measuring, comparing, as though every word his cousin uttered were a coin he was tallying against some private ledger of his own. "I hear you have taken up dancing lessons," Reginald said to her over the soup course, his tone light and conversational in a way that did not match the sharpness in his eyes. "How very ambitious, for someone so newly arrived among us. One wonders whether the village you came from held assemblies of its own, or whether this is all rather overwhelming for you." "Every skill begins as unfamiliar to someone," Eleanor replied evenly. "I imagine even you once needed to learn which fork suited which course, my lord, before it became second nature." A ripple of amusement crossed Gideon's face, quickly suppressed, and Reginald's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he recovered his easy smile. "Sharp tongue, for a girl so recently pulled from a cage." He said it lightly, as though offering a compliment, though the words landed with deliberate weight. "Edmund's daughter, through and through, I suppose. He was never a man to let an insult pass unanswered either, God rest him." "You knew my father well, then?" "Well enough." Something flickered behind Reginald's pale eyes, there and gone, before Eleanor could name it with certainty. Well enough to know. He trusted rather too easily, in the end. "A fault I hope you have not inherited along with his sharp tongue, Miss Whitmore." He turned the conversation smoothly toward estate matters after that, addressing Gideon directly about the northern holdings with a confidence that struck Eleanor as rehearsed, practiced, the way a man speaks when he has told the same careful version of events so many times he has nearly convinced himself of it. She listened without appearing to listen, cataloguing every figure he mentioned, every date, storing them away beside the portrait she had studied the night before and the warning Mrs. Bell had offered so reluctantly. When supper ended and Reginald departed for the evening, Gideon lingered a moment in the hall, watching his cousin's carriage disappear down the drive, with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. "He was not always so difficult," Gideon said quietly, almost to himself. "We were close, as boys. I have wondered, more than once, what changed him so thoroughly." He seemed to catch himself then, and offered Eleanor a small, apologetic smile. "Forgive me. Family history is rarely interesting to anyone outside the family." "I find I am rather interested in this particular family's history," Eleanor said carefully, and meant it more than he could possibly have understood. Gideon appeared at her door the next morning, with a folded newspaper under one arm, and an expression Eleanor had not yet seen on him, something almost sheepish, entirely unsuited to a man of his bearing. "I have arranged for you to be presented to society in 6 weeks' time," he said, without preamble. "There is a great deal you will need to learn before then. Etiquette, dancing, the proper way to address a room that will be looking for reasons to dismiss you before you have spoken a word. You want to teach me to be someone I am not. I want to teach you to survive a world that will not forgive you for being unprepared." His voice softened slightly. "Your father survived that world for 40 years, and he was a far gentler man than most who occupy it. You have his blood. I do not doubt you have his strength as well, But strength alone will not stop a drawing room from destroying you if you walk into it without armor. Eleanor thought of the armor she had recognized in him on the first day, folded and refolded until it no longer bent. She understood, suddenly, that he was offering to teach her how to build her own. The lessons began that afternoon and continued daily. A dancing master arrived from London, a thin, precise man who corrected her posture with a small cane, tapped gently against her spine. A woman named Madame Foray came to fit her for gowns in colors Eleanor had never owned and fabrics she had never touched, and though the fittings left her exhausted, she found herself, against her better judgment, beginning to enjoy the quiet pleasure of fine cloth against her skin. It was Gideon himself who taught her the etiquette of conversation, sitting across from her, in the study each evening, with a patience that surprised her more each day. "You must never let them see you calculating," he told her one evening, as rain traced patterns down the study windows. "The moment society believes you are thinking before you speak, they will assume you have something to hide. Speak plainly, speak warmly, save your calculations afterward, in private, where no one can see them working." That sounds exhausting. It is. He allowed himself the smallest smile, the first she had seen from him. You grow accustomed to it, or you learn to choose your battles carefully enough that the exhaustion becomes worthwhile. She studied him in the lamplight, this man who had pulled her from a cage and now spent his evenings teaching her which fork suited which course, and found herself curious about the grief she still saw flicker behind his eyes at unguarded moments. "Mrs. Bell mentioned your wife," she said carefully. "I am sorry for your loss." Something shuddered in his expression, quick and complete. "Margaret has been gone for 3 years. It is not a subject I discuss easily. I did not mean to intrude." "You did not." He set down his pen, and for a moment, the careful control in his posture eased, just slightly. It is only that grief becomes a private language after a time. One forgets how to translate it for anyone else. He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel seen rather than examined. "Perhaps that is why I recognized something in you, that first day. You have already begun learning that language yourself." Eleanor did not answer, because she did not trust her voice to hold steady if she tried. Instead, she returned to the etiquette book open on her lap, and the two of them sat in a silence that no longer felt as guarded as it once had, while the rain continued its quiet work against the glass. Later, walking back to her room, Eleanor understood something had shifted between them, small and unspoken, the beginning of a trust she had promised herself, only weeks before, that she would not extend easily to anyone in this house. She did not yet know whether that promise had already been broken, or whether it was only beginning to bend. The dancing lessons proved the most difficult of all her studies, not because the steps themselves were complicated, but because they required a closeness Eleanor had not anticipated when the thin, precise dancing master first arrived from London. It was Gideon, in the end, who partnered her most evenings once the master had departed, correcting her frame with a gentleness that surprised her each time, his hand light at her waist, his voice low, as he counted the measures beneath the music one of the housemaids played on the drawing-room pianoforte. "You are counting too loudly," he told her once, amusement warming his usually measured voice. "Your lips move with every beat. A partner across the room will read your rhythm before you have taken a single step. Forgive me for not being born knowing how to glide across a floor, as though gravity were merely a suggestion. I did not say it as a criticism." He turned her carefully, his hand steady at the small of her back. "I say it because you learn remarkably quickly when you stop trying so hard to master a thing all at once. You did the same with the etiquette lessons. You resist a rule for exactly as long as it takes you to understand why it exists, and then you simply become better at it than the people who invented it." Eleanor missed a step at that, though she recovered quickly enough that she hoped he had not noticed. He had noticed. She could tell by the small, private smile that touched the corner of his mouth before he schooled his expression back into its familiar composure. They practiced until the candles burned low, and somewhere in the space of an hour, the careful distance Eleanor had maintained since the carriage ride from Ashendale narrowed, without her quite deciding to allow it. She found herself laughing, once, at her own clumsy misstep, a sound she had not made freely in longer than she could easily remember, and Gideon's answering laugh, low and startled, as though he too had forgotten the shape of his own amusement, stayed with her long after she had retired to the blue room for the night. She lay awake, turning the evening over in her mind, uneasy with how easily the warmth had come, how little effort it had taken to forget, for the space of a single dance, every reason she had promised herself to remain guarded. The ledger she had not yet found still waited undiscovered in the study drawer. The truth of her father's death still slept, unspoken, somewhere within these walls. Eleanor reminded herself, sternly, that a man's kindness in a drawing room proved nothing about what he might or might not know of matters kept carefully out of a ward's sight, and resolved to remember that lesson more diligently than she had managed to that evening. Eleanor found the first ledger by accident, or told herself it was an accident, though later she would admit she had been looking for a reason to enter the study when Gideon was away in London for a week attending to Parliament. The room smelled of leather and old paper, and moonlight fell across the desk in a pale rectangle that seemed to point directly at the drawer she should not have opened. Inside, beneath correspondence and estate maps, she found a leather ledger marked in faded ink, Callaway Holdings, Northern Accounts. She should have closed the drawer. Instead, she carried the ledger to the window and read by moonlight, her heart climbing steadily into her throat, as the numbers began to tell a story no one in the house had offered to tell her directly. The Callaway estate, her father's estate, held coal rights in the north worth a fortune Eleanor could not fully calculate. For 11 years, those rights had been managed by Lord Reginald Cross, under an arrangement that, on paper, appeared entirely proper. But beneath the proper appearance, entries had been altered. Figures had been adjusted in a different hand than the rest of the ledger, always downward, always in Reginald's favor, always small enough that no single entry looked suspicious on its own. 11 years of small, careful thefts, adding up to a sum that made Eleanor's hands shake as she turned the final pages. And tucked into the back cover, folded so many times the creases had nearly worn through, was a letter that stopped her breath entirely. It was addressed to no one, dated the week before her father's death, written in a hand growing increasingly unsteady across the page. Edmund Whitmore had known. He had discovered the discrepancies in his own accounts and written down his suspicions, naming Reginald Cross directly, promising to bring the matter before the courts the following month. He never got the chance. The letter ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted and never returned to finish it. Eleanor sat in the moonlight for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands, and let herself feel, for the first time since the cage, something close to fury. Not the helpless anger of a girl who could not fight back, but a colder, steadier anger, the kind that did not weep but planned. Her father had not died of accident or illness. He had died because he discovered a theft and threatened to expose it, and the man responsible for that theft now sat at Ravenswood's breakfast table each week, smiling his mocking smile, calling her the Duke's little discovery. She copied the most damning entries into her own hand, before returning the ledger exactly as she had found it, the letter refolded along its worn creases and slipped back into the cover. She did not yet know who else might be involved, whether Gideon himself had any knowledge of the discrepancies he had allowed to continue for 11 years. She wanted, desperately, to believe he did not. But she had learned enough in her short life not to build her safety on wanting. When Gideon returned from London 3 days later, Eleanor greeted him with the same composed warmth he had spent weeks teaching her to offer a room full of strangers, and said nothing of what she had found. She had learned his own lesson well. Never let them see you calculating. But that night, alone in the blue room, she began, for the first time, to plan. She barely slept, turning the figures over in her mind until the numbers arranged themselves into a shape she could nearly hold. 11 years of small withdrawals, never large enough on their own to draw suspicion, all of it accumulating into a fortune that would have kept a dozen villages like Ashendale fed and sheltered for a generation. She thought of the wheat blight the villagers had blamed on her, of the hunger that had driven them to cruelty they might never have shown in a season of plenty, and wondered, with a bitterness she had not expected, whether some small portion of that stolen coal money might have eased the very poverty that led to her own suffering in that cage. The thought did not excuse what the villagers had done to her, but it complicated her anger in a way she had not anticipated, softening her fury toward Ashendale, even as it sharpened her fury toward the man who had, perhaps, made that poverty crueler than it needed to be. When Gideon returned from London, she watched him across the supper table with an attentiveness she hoped did not betray itself, searching his face for any flicker of guilt, any sign that the discrepancies in his own family's accounts were a secret he had chosen, for whatever reason, to protect. She found nothing but the same tired warmth he always carried after a week spent arguing points of legislation in a chamber full of men who rarely listened to reason when self-interest offered a louder argument. "You are quiet this evening," he observed, setting down his glass. "Is London gossip truly so much less interesting than whatever occupies your thoughts tonight?" "I am only tired," Eleanor said, offering the same practiced composure she had spent weeks learning to wear. "The dancing lessons have proven more demanding than I expected." He accepted the explanation without pressing further, and Eleanor felt, not for the first time, the particular loneliness of carrying a secret inside a house full of people who had begun, cautiously, to feel almost like family. She missed the simplicity of Ashendale's cruelty, in a strange way. A village that hated her openly had at least never asked her to pretend otherwise. The Ravenswood name opened every door in London, and Eleanor's first assembly, held in the ballroom of Lady Fairmont's townhouse, proved that open doors did not always lead to welcome. She entered Gideon's arm, dressed in pale grey silk that Madame Foray had insisted would draw eyes without appearing to seek them, and felt every gaze in the room land on her at once, weighing, measuring, deciding. "The cage girl," she heard someone whisper behind a fan, not quite quietly enough. Fancy that the Duke would parade her about, as though she were born to it. Eleanor kept her chin level and her expression pleasant, exactly as she had been taught, though the whisper found its mark regardless. She had expected cruelty. She had not expected how much it would still manage to hurt, wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile. "Ignore them," Gideon murmured, close enough that only she could hear. "They will talk regardless of what you do. Let them talk about your composure instead of your origins." She danced twice, both times with gentlemen Gideon had selected carefully, men whose good opinion carried weight in rooms that mattered. She smiled through comments about her accent, her posture, her sudden and suspicious elevation, and each time she felt the sting, she reminded herself of the ledger folded in her memory, of the letter her father never finished, of the anger that had learned to wait rather than burst. It was near midnight, during a lull in the dancing, that Reginald found her near the refreshment table, his smile as mocking as ever. "You are managing rather well, Miss Whitmore, for a girl who was screaming in a cage a month ago." He selected a glass of champagne with unhurried ease. "One almost forgets where you came from." "One does forget a great many things, when it suits them," Eleanor said, and watched something flicker across Reginald's face, quick and careful, gone before she could name it with certainty. "A curious thing to say, is it?" She held his gaze, steady, the way Gideon had taught her to hold a room's attention without raising her voice. "I find that people who profit most from forgetting often work hardest to encourage it in others." For the first time since she had met him, Lord Reginald Cross did not have an easy answer ready. He recovered quickly, offering a shallow bow and a comment about the excellent quality of the evening's champagne, But Eleanor had seen the crack in his composure, brief as it was, and she carried it with her like a small, sharp stone. She said nothing of the exchange to Gideon on the carriage ride home, though she noticed him watching her more closely than usual, as though he sensed something had shifted in the ballroom that he had not been present to witness. "You did well tonight," he said finally, as the carriage rolled through darkened streets. "Better than well. I watched half that room reconsider their opinion of you before the evening ended. Half a room is not the whole of society." "No," he agreed, and something in his voice carried a warmth she had not heard from him before. "But it is a beginning, and beginnings, in my experience, have a way of becoming everything, if a person is patient enough to see them through." Eleanor looked at him in the dim carriage light, at the careful control he wore like a second skin, and wondered, not for the first time, how much of that control was armor, and how much of it had simply become the shape of the man himself. She thought of the ledger, of the letter, of Reginald's careful smile cracking for just a moment beside the refreshment table. The beginning he spoke of, she suspected, was closer to its ending than either of them yet realized. The weeks that followed the assembly brought a steady stream of invitations to Ravenswood's door, each one a small victory Eleanor had not expected to feel so keenly. She attended a garden party where two matrons who had whispered behind their fans a month before now competed for a place beside her at the refreshment table, eager to claim early acquaintance with a young woman society had decided, almost overnight, was worth knowing. She attended the theatre, where Gideon's box drew as many eyes as the stage below, and found herself, to her own surprise, enjoying the performance more than the attention it invited. But it was a smaller gathering, a private dinner, hosted by Lady Fairmont only a fortnight after the assembly, that taught Eleanor the sharpest lesson of her new education. Seated beside an elderly dowager, renowned for her long memory and longer tongue, Eleanor found herself drawn into a conversation about the Calloway estate that revealed more than she expected. "Your father's death was a great scandal in its own quiet way, you understand," the dowager said, sipping her wine with the unbothered confidence of a woman who had long since stopped fearing consequence. A fall from a horse. He had ridden without incident for 20 years. On a stretch of road he knew better than his own drawing room. There was talk at the time. Talk that faded rather more quickly than such talk usually does, once his cousin settled the estate's affairs so efficiently. "What kind of talk?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice carefully light. "Oh, the usual sort. That a man does not simply fall from a horse he has ridden 1,000 times without difficulty. That the physician who examined him was rather too eager to close the matter without proper inquiry. Rumors, mostly. And rumors have a way of drowning beneath grief, especially when the family left behind seems disinclined to pursue them further." The dowager studied Eleanor with eyes far sharper than her age suggested. "You have his look about you, child. I noticed it the moment you entered the room tonight. It is rather remarkable, actually, how thoroughly you resemble a man most of society had entirely forgotten." Eleanor thanked the dowager for her candor and steered the conversation toward safer waters, but she carried the exchange home with her that night, like a fourth piece of evidence to add beside the ledger, the letter, and Sarah's careful warning on her very first evening at Ravenswood. Society had suspected, once, that something was wrong with Edmund Whitmore's death. Society had simply allowed itself to forget, because remembering was inconvenient, and grief, left unattended long enough, eventually stops demanding an audience. Eleanor resolved quietly that she would not allow the world to forget a second time. The break came from a source Eleanor had not expected. Sarah, the young maid who had offered her quiet kindness on her first night at Ravenswood, found her alone in the garden one grey afternoon and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether Eleanor might spare a moment to speak with her aunt. "She was a nurse, miss, years back, at Calloway House, before your father passed. She's never spoken of it, not properly, not to anyone, but she's grown poorly this winter, and last week she said something to my mother that frightened her enough to write to me straight away." Eleanor arranged to visit within the day. Traveling under the pretense of a charitable errand, Gideon readily approved, without asking further questions. The nurse, a frail woman named Agnes Pruitt, lived in a small cottage on the edge of a village 2 hours from Ravenswood, and when Eleanor arrived, Agnes studied her face for a long moment, before her eyes filled with tears. "You have his eyes," Agnes said quietly. "Lord Edmund's eyes. I would know them anywhere. I held you the night you were born, miss, and I held your mother's hand the night she fled with you, 12 years past, when Lord Edmund told her the household was no longer safe." Eleanor sat carefully beside the old woman's chair, her heart pounding. "Please, tell me everything you remember." Agnes's account came slowly, in fragments interrupted by coughing and long pauses to gather her breath, but the shape of it emerged clear enough by the end. In the weeks before Edmund Whitmore's death, the household had grown tense with whispered arguments behind closed study doors. Agnes had overheard enough to understand that the Earl had discovered something in his cousin's management of the northern accounts, something serious enough that he intended to involve the courts. 3 nights before he died, Edmund had come to Agnes directly and asked her to help his wife and infant daughter disappear, to protect them from whatever came next. He had not lived to explain what he feared. He had died within the week, officially of a fall from his horse, though Agnes had never believed it. Not for a moment. Not in 12 years of silence bought by fear, and, she admitted with shame, by a small pension that arrived quietly each quarter, from an account she had never questioned closely enough to trace. "I should have spoken sooner," Agnes said, gripping Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. "I told myself, silence kept you safe. I have wondered, every year since, whether silence only kept him safe instead." Eleanor left the cottage with a written statement Agnes had insisted on providing, her shaking hand nonetheless steady enough to sign her name beneath an account that, combined with the copied ledger entries and her father's unfinished letter, formed something no drawing room could dismiss, as the fantasy of a cage girl grasping at inheritance. She had a story now. She had evidence. What she did not yet have was a way to present it that would not simply see the evidence buried again, quietly, the way Agnes's silence had been bought and buried for 12 long years. That night, walking the Ravenswood gardens alone, Eleanor understood that the next move required more than evidence. It required a stage large enough that burying the truth would cost more than any single man could afford to pay. She thought of the grand ball Gideon had mentioned only days before, an event meant to formally present her to the full breadth of London society, and felt the shape of a plan begin to form, patient and precise, the way she had once learned to be patient, waiting for a cage door that finally opened. On the ride home from Agnes Pruitt's cottage, Eleanor's carriage was forced to a sudden stop on a narrow stretch of road, bordered by dense woodland, the coachman calling down that a fallen tree blocked their path. Eleanor waited inside, uneasy without quite knowing why, until she noticed a rider watching from the tree line, too far to identify clearly, close enough that his presence felt deliberate rather than coincidental. By the time the coachman and a passing farmer cleared enough of the fallen branches to continue, the rider had vanished, and Eleanor told herself, unconvincingly, that country roads simply attracted country travelers going about their own business. She said nothing of the incident to Gideon, unwilling to explain her visit to Agnes Pruitt, without revealing far more than she was yet prepared to share. But she began, from that evening forward, taking greater care with her movements outside Ravenswood's walls. She varied her routes when charitable errands took her beyond the estate. She kept the copied ledger pages and Agnes's eventual statement, once it arrived, hidden not in her room, but in a locked box entrusted to Mrs. Bell, whose loyalty Eleanor had come to trust more completely with each passing week of careful, quiet observation. Mrs. Bell, for her part, asked no questions when Eleanor pressed the small box into her keeping, only nodded once, gravely, and tucked it away among her own linens with the practiced discretion of a woman who had kept Ravenswood's quieter secrets for longer than Eleanor had been alive. "You'll forgive an old housekeeper for saying so, miss," Mrs. Bell offered, as she locked the box away. "But there's a look about you tonight that reminds me rather strongly of His Grace, the first winter after his father passed and left him the whole weight of this estate at 24. A person can only carry a burden alone for so long before it either breaks them or makes them formidable. I have watched you closely these past months, and I do not believe, whatever is troubling you, that it will be the former." Eleanor thanked her, throat tight with an emotion she did not trust herself to examine too closely, and returned to her room to find, for the first time in weeks, a night's sleep that came without the ledger's numbers circling endlessly behind her closed eyes. Eleanor knew she could not confront Reginald Cross alone, not with evidence that a clever solicitor could dismiss as forged or circumstantial if presented without the proper authority behind it. She needed someone trained in exactly the kind of scrutiny her documents would face, someone with no loyalty to either side of the Ravenswood family that might color their judgment. She found him through Mrs. Bell, who, once Eleanor finally trusted her enough to explain the shape of what she had discovered, proved to have connections Eleanor had not anticipated from a housekeeper's quiet position in the world. His name was Mr. Nathaniel Hartwell, a solicitor known for taking cases others refused, cases that pitted him against powerful families willing to spend considerable sums protecting their reputations. He arrived at a small inn outside London, chosen deliberately for its distance from anyone likely to recognize either of them, and listened to Eleanor's account with a careful, unhurried attention that reminded her, oddly, of the patience Gideon had shown her in their earliest lessons together. "The ledger entries alone would raise questions," Nathaniel said finally, examining the copied pages Eleanor had brought. "Combined with the nurse's statement and your father's letter, you have the foundation of a serious case. But foundation is not proof, Miss Whitmore. A skilled opponent will argue the ledger was altered by someone with motive to frame him, and the letter, unsigned as it is at its end, could be dismissed as an unfinished draft, never meant for anyone's eyes. Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest we authenticate everything beyond reasonable doubt before you present a single page of it publicly." Nathaniel's eyes were sharp, calculating in a manner Eleanor recognized and, for the first time in weeks, found genuinely reassuring rather than threatening. "I will have the ledger's altered entries examined by a document expert I trust completely. I will take Mrs. Pruitt's statement myself, formally, with a magistrate's clerk present to witness it properly. And I will search the county records for any additional correspondence between your father and the courts he intended to approach before his death." The work took 3 careful weeks, conducted in secret while Eleanor continued her lessons at Ravenswood and smiled through Reginald's visits as though nothing in the world had changed. She grew skilled at the deception, better than she liked to admit, holding entire conversations with the man responsible for her father's death, while giving no sign of the case building quietly against him beyond the walls of Ravenswood Hall. The hardest part, she found, was maintaining that same composure with Gideon. He had grown warmer toward her with each passing week, his careful control softening in small, private moments that Eleanor found herself anticipating more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. He complimented her progress with a genuine pride that reached his eyes now, rather than the polite approval of early lessons. He sought her opinion on matters beyond her etiquette training, asking what she thought of a tenant dispute, a piece of proposed legislation, a question of household management, and listening to her answers with a seriousness that made her feel, for the first time in her life, that her thoughts carried genuine weight. She wanted, desperately, to trust that his warmth was untainted by whatever knowledge he might or might not hold about his cousin's crimes. Nathaniel had found nothing, in 3 weeks of careful searching, that connected Gideon directly to the altered accounts. But absence of evidence was not the same as innocence, and Eleanor had learned that lesson too thoroughly in a village square to abandon it now. however much her heart argued otherwise, in the quiet hours after their evening lessons ended. "You seem distracted lately," Gideon observed one evening, setting aside the correspondence he had been reviewing to study her more closely. "Is something troubling you?" "Only the ordinary nerves of a woman about to be presented to the whole of society at once," Eleanor said, and was grateful the lie came easily, though it cost her something to offer it to a man whose eyes, in that moment, held nothing but genuine concern. "You need not be nervous. You have become remarkable, Eleanor," he said her given name softly, the first time he had used it without the formality of her surname attached, and warmth spread through Eleanor in a way she did not yet have the courage to name. She held his gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and neither of them looked away first. Nathaniel's final report arrived 4 days later, thorough and damning, authenticated beyond any reasonable challenge a solicitor might raise. Eleanor read it alone in her room by candlelight, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that whatever warmth had grown between herself and Gideon Ashford would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine, on a ballroom floor, already being prepared for a ball meant to celebrate her arrival into a world that had no idea what she intended to do with the evening. Nathaniel had also arranged, quietly and at Eleanor's insistence, for a magistrate of unimpeachable reputation to be invited among the ball's guests, a family friend of Lady Fairmont's whose presence would raise no suspicion until the moment it mattered most. The plan, laid out across 3 careful weeks, required a precision Eleanor had not known she was capable of until she found herself living inside it, coordinating letters and meetings through Mrs. Bell's discreet network of trusted servants, all while continuing to smile through Reginald's visits and deepen, against every careful instinct she still tried to maintain, whatever was growing between herself and the Duke. She visited Nathaniel Hartwell's office in London one final time before the ball, ostensibly to review a charitable trust Gideon had asked her to help establish, a convenient cover story that had, by then, become almost entirely true, since Eleanor had thrown herself into the trust's planning with a genuine passion for easing the kind of poverty that had once nearly ended her own life. "You understand," Nathaniel said, as they reviewed the final arrangements, "that once you speak these words publicly, there is no retreat from them. Lord Reginald Cross will not go quietly, and men of his standing have resources to fight even the clearest evidence, for a time. Are you prepared for what follows, regardless of how the evening itself unfolds? I have spent 11 years not knowing my father was murdered, and 4 days in a cage believing no one in the world would ever come for me," Eleanor said. "I have learned a great deal about what I am prepared to endure, Mr. Hartwell. I do not intend to stop now, whatever the cost." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his sharp features. "Your father would be proud of the woman his daughter became, Miss Whitmore. Cage or no cage. I have represented a great many clients in my career. I have rarely represented one I believed in so completely." The grand ball arrived on a clear autumn evening, the Ravenswood ballroom transformed into something out of a dream Eleanor could not have imagined a year before. Chandeliers ablaze with 1,000 candles, the air thick with the scent of hothouse flowers, arranged in careful abundance along every surface. Madame Forêt had outdone herself with the gown, a deep sapphire silk trimmed in black lace that Eleanor had chosen specifically, deliberately, for the way it made her feel steady rather than delicate. A sapphire pendant, the one item of her mother's jewelry that had survived their years of poverty, rested against her collarbone, a small anchor to the truth she intended to speak that evening. Gideon found her in the corridor outside the ballroom an hour before the guests were due to arrive, and the look on his face when he saw her stopped whatever practiced greeting she had prepared. "You are extraordinary," he said simply, and there was nothing polite or rehearsed in the way he said it. "I have a great deal riding on this evening," Eleanor admitted, and it was, at least, an honest thing to say, even if it revealed less than the whole truth. You have carried more than any young woman should be asked to carry, and you have done it with more grace than most who were born to this world could manage." Gideon stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of grey beginning at his temples, the small scar above his left eyebrow she had never asked about. "I intend to announce your formal adoption tonight, Eleanor, not merely as my ward, but as my acknowledged heir to everything Ravenswood holds, alongside your restoration to the Calloway title your father always intended for you." The words landed with unexpected weight. Eleanor had known this announcement was coming, had planned her own evening around the moment it would occur, but hearing it spoken aloud, in his voice, with such open sincerity, nearly undid the careful composure she had spent weeks perfecting. "Why?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer, and needed, to hear him say it regardless. "Because Edmund asked me to protect you, and protection, I have come to understand, means more than simply keeping you safe from cages and cruelty." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers steady, despite the storm building quietly beneath her calm exterior. "It means giving you every tool to build the life you deserve, on your own terms, answerable to no one who does not deserve your answers. And because somewhere in these past months, Eleanor, I found myself caring for you in a way I did not expect to feel again after Margaret. I did not intend to tell you tonight, of all nights, but I find I no longer wish to carry that feeling in silence." Eleanor's throat tightened with an emotion too complicated to name in a single word. She thought of the ledger, of the letter, of Agnes Pruitt's trembling hands signing her statement, of the evidence sitting locked in Nathaniel Hartwell's careful custody, ready to be presented that very evening in front of every witness London society could offer. She thought of how much this man standing before her, offering his heart with such open vulnerability, did not yet know about the storm she intended to bring into his ballroom within the hour. "There is something you should know," she began carefully, "before tonight proceeds any further." But before she could continue, a footman appeared at the end of the corridor, announcing the first arriving guests, and the moment slipped away, folded into the demands of an evening already set irrevocably into motion. "Whatever it is," Gideon said gently, reading the hesitation in her face, "it can wait until after tonight, if you wish it to. Tonight, I only want the world to see what I have known for some time, that you are remarkable, Eleanor Whitmore, and that Ravenswood is fortunate beyond measure to claim you." He offered his arm, and Eleanor took it, her heart a tangle of dread and hope she had no name precise enough to describe, and together they walked toward a ballroom, already filled with candlelight, champagne, and every member of society who had once whispered about the cage girl behind their fans. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. What happens next changes everything. The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, and Eleanor stood at its center in sapphire silk, the folded documents Nathaniel Hartwell had prepared, held carefully in white-gloved hands, waiting for the moment Gideon began the announcement that would, in mere minutes, collide with the truth she carried. Gideon rose to address the room, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, speaking of a promise made 11 years before to a friend he had loved like a brother, of a daughter finally found and restored to the life that had always belonged to her. The crowd listened with the particular hush reserved for scandal, about to resolve itself into respectability, and Eleanor watched Lord Reginald Cross, standing near the refreshment table with a glass of champagne he had not yet touched, his pale eyes fixed on Gideon, with an expression that had not yet caught up to the danger approaching him. When Gideon reached toward her, ready to formally present her restored title before the assembled crowd, Eleanor stepped forward and, gently but firmly, spoke before he could finish. "Before this announcement proceeds, there is something the room deserves to know, something I believe my father, Edmund Whitmore, Earl of Calloway, died attempting to expose." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Gideon's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, and Eleanor saw, for one unguarded moment, real hurt cross his features before he mastered it, unaware of what was coming, uncertain whether he himself was about to become its target. My father did not die from a fall from his horse, as the household was told 11 years ago. Eleanor's voice remained steady, carrying clearly across the silent room. He died days after discovering that the northern coal accounts of the Callaway estate had been systematically altered for years, the profits diverted quietly into the pockets of the man entrusted to manage them honestly. Every eye in the room turned toward Reginald Cross, whose careful composure had begun, at last, to crack entirely, the color draining from his face, as Eleanor produced the copied ledger pages, her father's unfinished letter, and the notarized statement of Agnes Pruitt. Passing them into the hands of a magistrate Nathaniel had quietly arranged to be present among the evening's guests. "You cannot possibly," Reginald began, but his voice lacked its usual mocking confidence, thin and strained under the weight of 200 watching eyes. "I can, and I have," Eleanor said, "because a woman you and your household believed had been silenced forever, kept her conscience for 12 years, and finally chose to honor it rather than her fear." She turned to address the room fully now, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I was not found by chance, though I believe His Grace's grief and kindness were entirely genuine. I was hidden as an infant because my father feared for my life, and that fear was justified. He was murdered for discovering a theft that this man was determined to protect, no matter the cost to the family that trusted him." The magistrate stepped forward to examine the documents, and the ballroom erupted into a controlled, horrified chaos of whispers and gasps, 200 witnesses watching a scandal unfold in real time that would occupy London's drawing rooms for a full season to come. Gideon turned to Reginald, and Eleanor watched a lifetime of careful family loyalty collapse in his expression, replaced by something colder and more absolute than she had ever seen him display. "Is this true?" Reginald's silence answered more completely than any denial could have. "You let me believe his death was an accident," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Eleanor had never heard from him. "You sat at my table for 11 years, ate at my expense, managed accounts I trusted you with entirely, while Edmund's daughter grew up in poverty, and I searched for a child I believed had simply vanished." "Gideon, I can explain." "You can explain to the magistrate," Gideon said, and turned his back on his cousin entirely, a gesture more devastating in its finality than any accusation could have been. Reginald was escorted from the ballroom within minutes, his protests growing increasingly desperate as the magistrate's men closed around him, and the assembled crowd watched the Duke of Ravenswood's cousin removed from a house he had schemed for years to inherit, his careful mask finally, completely broken, before an audience that would remember every detail for years to come. When the ballroom finally settled, Gideon turned to Eleanor, and the hurt she had glimpsed earlier had transformed into something closer to awe. "You planned this evening for weeks," he said quietly, "and told me nothing. I did not know how to tell you that the man you called family had orchestrated my father's death without knowing whether you might have reason to protect him regardless." Eleanor met his eyes steadily, though her heart pounded fiercely beneath her composed exterior. "I could not risk my father's justice on a hope, however much I wanted to trust you completely. And now I know you are exactly the man I hoped you were, when you opened that cage with your own hands and asked for nothing in return." Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time that evening, a genuine smile. "I am sorry for the silence, Gideon. I am not sorry for what I did with it." Gideon studied her for a long moment, and then, in front of a ballroom still buzzing with the shock of the evening's revelations, he took her hand and pressed a kiss to it that was equal parts reverence and relief. "Then let us finish what this evening was always meant to accomplish," he said. "Not merely the restoration of your title, all of it, Eleanor, if you will have me. Your father asked me to protect his daughter. I find I would very much like to spend the rest of my life doing precisely that, as her husband, if she will allow it. The room, still recovering from the scandal, found itself witness to a proposal instead, and Eleanor, who had walked into that ballroom, prepared for battle, and found, instead, both justice and love waiting on the other side of it, said yes, before he had entirely finished asking. In the weeks that followed, Reginald Cross stood trial for fraud and for his role in orchestrating the circumstances of Edmund Whitmore's death. The northern coal fortune was restored in full to the Calloway estate under Eleanor's own management, and Agnes Pruitt spent her final years in a comfortable cottage on Ravenswood land, finally free of the guilt she had carried for 12 silent years. Eleanor Whitmore, once the cage girl of Ashendale, became the Countess of Calloway in her own right, and, within the year, Duchess of Ravenswood, a woman who had learned that survival was only the beginning of a life, and that the truest power available to anyone came not from being rescued, but from having the courage to finish the fight herself once the cage door finally opened. The lesson she carried forward, and the one she hoped every person watching her story might carry forward as well, was simple enough to fit in a single sentence, though it had taken her a cage, a manor house, and a ballroom full of candlelight to learn it fully. Kindness deserves gratitude, but justice deserves action, and the two are never quite the same thing. A year later, on the anniversary of the day the Duke's carriage had first crested the hill above Ashendale, Eleanor returned to the village that had once left her to starve behind iron bars, not for revenge, but to open a school for the children of families too poor to educate them otherwise, funded quietly from the very coal fortune Reginald Cross had once tried to steal for himself. The villagers who greeted her at the school's opening did not recognize at first the composed and elegant Duchess standing before them as the same girl who had once wasted away in their square. When recognition finally dawned across the crowd, Eleanor watched shame and gratitude war across faces she remembered all too well, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no satisfaction in their discomfort, only a tired, settled peace, the kind that comes from having finally closed a wound rather than simply covering it over. Gideon stood beside her that day, as he had stood beside her through the trial, through the long months of restoring the Calloway estate to order, through every quiet evening since the ball, when they had continued the habit of sitting together by lamplight, though the conversations had grown considerably less guarded than those first careful lessons in etiquette. He took her hand as the village children filed into their new schoolroom, and Eleanor thought of the cage, of the ledger, of Agnes Pruitt's trembling signature, of every careful step that had carried her from that iron cage to this particular sunlit morning. "You are far away this morning," Gideon said quietly, watching the children settle into rows of new desks. "Only grateful," Eleanor said, and meant it entirely. "A door opened when it did, and I hope I have found the good sense to do something worthwhile with the years it gave me. Thank you for staying with Eleanor's story until the very end. If her journey moved you, subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Until the next story, take care of yourselves and never mistake a closed door for the end of your own strength.